Annabel Gonzalez. I'm Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and I am delighted to welcome you to this session of our series, Trade Dialogues. I will be your moderator for the first part of this event, and my colleague, Gabrielle Marceau, Counselor for Research and Legal Policy, will take over from me during the second part of the session. Today, we are delighted to have with us Gregory Schaefer to present his latest book entitled Emerging Powers and the World Trading System, The Past and Future of International Economic Law. This is a fascinating book which addresses a question that is critical to the trading system today, which is how has the international trade and broader economic legal order changed since the WTO's creation because of Brazil's, India's, and China's rise and their development of trade law capacity. So this is a book that provides a necessary complement to the economic and political accounts for understanding why, at a time of hegemonic transition, where economic security and geopolitics assume greater roles, then the United States challenged and emerging powers became defenders of the legal order that the United States created. So these are some of the key topics that Gregory will be discussing in his presentation. So let me formally introduce Professor Gregory Schaefer, whom we are delighted to have with us. He is Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California at Irvine. He's a globally recognized expert on law and globalization with a specialization in international trade law. His newest book is the one he will be presenting to us today on emerging powers and the world trading system, the past and future of international economic law. But he also has other 8 books and over 100 articles and book chapters addressing a wide range of issues, such as transnational legal ordering, the impact of the rise of China and other emerging economies, and the way trade and investment law implicates domestics. So after Greg's initial presentation, we have an excellent set of discussants who will share with us their views on these topics. And they are also highly recognized. I'm also very appreciative that they are with us today. They are Jennifer Hillman, who currently is Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Professor of Practice at Georgetown University Law Center. Jennifer is former member of the WTO Appellate Body, Commissioner of the U.S. International Trade Commission, and USTR General Counsel. We are also delighted to have with us Professor Amrita Narlikar, who is the president of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, an honorary fellow, Darwin College, University of Cambridge. She is the author or editor of 11 books, which include the World Trade Organization, A Very Short Introduction, and the Oxford Handbook on the World Trade Organization, both published by Oxford University Press. Her latest book, Poverty Narratives and Power Paradoxes in International Trade and Negotiations, and Beyond, came out with Cambridge University Press last year. And last but not least, we have our own John Hancock, who has worked at the WTO Secretariat since 1997. And he has served in a variety of roles, including as policy advisor to the Director General, representative to the IMF and the World Bank, and counselor for policy development. He has helped members launch the Aid for Trade initiative, the structured discussions on investment facilitation, and the recent informal dialogue on sustainable plastics trade. So welcome to all of you. And let me now hand it over to Greg to please make your presentation. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Annabelle. I'm sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see it clearly. And I'll speak quickly so we can get to the issues. And so this particular presentation of the book is based on almost 20 years of work, and clearly what the system has changed significantly. Initially, I was aimed to address the developing countries more broadly, and how could they develop legal capacity to actually have their voices heard within the world trading system. But things shifted, and clearly China, Brazil, first Brazil, then India and China became quite successful in engaging with the world trading system. I call this para-ethnography because although I use multiple methods, I talked with many people who are perhaps in our audience here in Geneva, as well as in the capitals and major cities of China, India, and Brazil. And para-ethnography refers to elite interviews where everyone is uncertain, including in trying to discover and make sense of the challenges that they face in front of them. So it's very much a conversation. The paradox, as Annabelle mentioned, at the core of the book is that the US was the primary actor, both in the creation of the GATT after World War II, when the US emerged as a world power, and then after in 1994, 1995, after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, where once more the US was predominant, and of course working with others, the European Union and other countries had played their roles. But what's fascinating is that political scientists such as John Eikenberry suggest that what the United States has done, and this is a bit of an oxymoron, is that it's a hegemonic power, it's a leviathan, but it aims to create a liberal order where it subjects itself to the rules. But since the rules primarily they reflect US positions, US versions of capitalism, the US didn't have to change nearly as many laws and institutions compared to China, Brazil, and India, which the book addresses. And so then typically the prediction is it's the rising powers that will challenge the existing system and not the current dominant power. So what explains this? And the economic narratives, Geneva, Richard Baldwin has his brilliant work on global supply chains and the combination of Western know-how and inexpensive labor to make supply chains more efficient, gave rise to export powerhouses in Asia, in particular China, but also other countries. And it led to a switch, and you see this sort of shift in global GDP, both in terms of per capita GDP and purchasing power parity and nominal GDP. And China has, as you can see on the right-hand side, China and the three emerging powers have already surpassed the United States. So this is a shift in power. Of course, also taking place through was that there's a massive increases in inequality in the United States, as those plugged into globalization did quite well and others less so. So the book's central question is, how has the international trade and broader economic legal order changed since the WTO's creation because of Brazil's, India's, and China's rise in their development of trade law capacity? So the focus is providing a complementary account of how trade law capacity was critical for Brazil, India, and China, and any other country to engage with the system and affect it potentially. So the three questions, this central question is really broken down into three. How did they invest in trade law capacity to take on the United States and European Union at the WTO and defend their interests? In doing so, how did these emerging powers change internally? And that's, I think, a major contribution of the book, because I worked with authors from Henry Gao in China, Asim Messina and James Nadumpra in India, and Michel Raton Sanchez Badin in Brazil, to really talk with all the players and sketch out the major legal, institutional, and professional changes taking place internally in these countries. And third, once they did this recursively, what's the implications for the broader development of the international economic law order? And so this builds from a theoretical approach of mine, which looks at how norms are constructed, flow, settled, and unsettled transnationally across levels of social organization. So the book combines a study of internal law and internal institutions with what's taking place in Geneva and outside of Geneva with respect to the trading system. I define trade law capacity broadly as ability of a country through harnessing resources to use law to defend and advance its international and domestic trade and trade implicated policies. Trade law capacity is a mechanism, it's a form of power to advance interests in a contested legal field out of trade law. Trade law capacity matters. I break it down in terms of 9 ways it matters. It's much more than just litigation. It matters for drafting and negotiating international trade rules, coming up with new modalities and so forth, needing to work with economists. It involves monitoring foreign compliance with commitments, bringing complaints successfully in specific cases, shaping the terms of trade effects affecting a country's social welfare, shaping the interpretation, application, and social understanding of the meaning of the law over time, bargaining then in the shadow of the law, both as regards future negotiations and the strategic pursuit of settlement in discrete cases, protecting domestic policy space for developmental and regulatory initiatives, and also warding off captures by protectionist sectors. And finally, triggering spillover effects, such as catalyzing a greater role for a country's lawyers in international private law settings. So as a general counsel of a major Chinese SOE told me, even though she's not focused on WTO law, she said it completely changed our mentality of the WTO with respect to law, legal ordering, contracts, and so forth. So investing in trade law capacity involved greater professionalization of a trade bureaucracy, coordination amongst ministries, new career paths, and it's Janus-based in the sense that the trade representatives are both looking internally with respect to their domestic legal and regulatory systems and externally, simultaneously. There's massive coverage in the media in these countries with respect to the WTO and trade law, changes in academia, new courses, moot courts. The photograph is the moot court winners in China of a WTO competition, which then is very prestigious. They could go into government, into private law firms, and so forth, academia. Greater role for lawyers in trade, the private bar develops. Changes in the private sector, specialists, think tanks, and the formation of public-private partnerships. Many critique sort of the impact of the WTO as a term towards neoliberalism. But actually, if you look at what took place with these 3 countries, the international trade regime seeded incentives for institutional changes to develop trade law capacity. The state policy favored public-private partnerships. The embedding of public and private legal expertise regarding trade within these states enabled them to build state capacity to adapt, respond to, and potentially and recursively shape the transnational legal order for trade. In some, the transnational processes did not lead to the weakening of the state, but rather the strengthening of its capacity to play an active role internationally in the legal ordering of trade. The implications, it became much more difficult for the former leading members in WTO to conclude agreements to their satisfaction. You have stalemate. You have led to the potential demise of multilateral dispute settlement, at least through the appellate body as a World Trade Court. And that became clear just listening to certain US representatives this past weekend at the SEAL conference. And fragmentation, as much trade law norm making is taking place outside of the WTO. And as a result, we now have competing bilateral and regional initiatives for the transnational legal ordering of trade, which raises the question, what's the benefit of trade law capacity going forward? You see a massive investments ongoing with respect to law, but law, as the book theorizes, it involves both an instrument, a tool to advance interests, which is sometimes referenced as lawfare, but also a public good to solve problems. And I think we're seeing a shift more towards law in the lawfare sense, in the public good sense, but it will continue, I hope, to involve the public good sense as well. Finally, you see this move to regional plurilateral initiatives, bilateral deals, unilateralism, and the challenge is what's the role for the WTO in this more complex ecology of trade law. So thank you. That's it. I'll stop sharing.
So thank you very much, Greg, for this introduction of your book Let me now turn it to Jennifer to share her initial thoughts with us. Jennifer.
Well, thank you very much. It's a huge honor to be here. I will confess that I was one of the lucky ones that got in on some of the pre-reading of this book during its development. So again, it is a fascinating book, and Greg and his colleagues have made a huge contribution. So terrific to get here. I wanted to start my opening comments with my own sort of sense of, sort of how did we get here in terms of where we are with the sort of demise of the WTO. And I'm going to sort of throw out 4 or 5 things, some of which I think are clearly reflected in Greg's book and some of which sort of may not be. And part of it to me is, I keep being reminded of that Joni Mitchell song, "You Don't Know What You've Got Until It's Gone." There is, I think, a huge element of all of us sort of forgetting or neglecting sort of all of the good that has come from the WTO system and constantly forgetting to sort of remind our various constituents, in terms of whether it's how much trade flow goes under WTO rules, how much stability and predictability we got as a result of those, how many people are raised out of poverty, how much growth, in both world trade and GDP came out of it. And the concern I have is whether you have to get all the way to the bottom before you start to realize, how much good you had before it all goes. But the second point I would only make is where Greg kind of left off, because to me, an awful lot of how did we get to where we are today is this growth of regionalism and regional trade agreements, and the degree to which they have pulled a lot of the political energy, the economic energy. I mean, a huge amount of the focus of trade negotiators has been on regional trade agreements. And to the extent that they've done that, there has been, I think, a significant withdrawal from commitments to the WTO and an ability to, again, to do this forgetting of what you've got until it's gone. And you've seen, a tremendous rise. And again, I would say it's to some degree in 2 of the 3 regions that Greg, to some degree, not entirely where Greg is focused. No question, Asia has become the dominant trading bloc. I mean, if you look at it, 50% of all goods in the world are made in Asia. And if you then look at the data, 60% of all trade is intra-Asian trade. I mean, so they have become a very close, tight block among themselves. You then secondly have the North American and the European trading blocks, where 40% of the rest of the goods in the world are made. And again, significant, nowhere near as high as Asia, but significant intra-regional trade. Left out of that is to some degree Brazil and India. I mean, 2 of the focus countries that Greg focused on, where you haven't seen as much regionalism. So I think this is a sort of interesting dilemma of how do we want to think about regionalism and where it's headed. And part of my reaction to it is it's not going away. I mean, if you think of the forces that really drove globalization, it was a lot of moving overseas in part to gain access to either cheaper labor or certain raw materials or certain inputs. A lot of that, I think, has changed with the growth of, everything from 3D printing to artificial intelligence, to the fact that you don't need as much of labor as a component in anything that you make. The forces that drove these far-flung supply chains, to me, are changing and changing fundamentally. That desire of everybody to click on a screen today and have the good delivered to your door within hours, if not by tomorrow, I think is pushing to go sort of more regional. Third thing I will say is I think there has been a failure to recognize, and again, I would put this mostly on the United States, the political importance of trade remedies. I think many in the WTO system underestimated how substantial it was, that there was decision after decision after decision that made it harder to use trade remedies, and how much resentment that bred. And again, I think all the economists tended to step away and say, oh, well, trade remedies only affect 2% of all goods traded or 1% of all goods traded, and therefore this can't possibly have a big effect. And the reality is it was decision after decision. No, you cannot zero. No, you have to say that the only state-owned enterprises that counts in terms of subsidies is one that is, a function, has a governmental function, etc. The last thing I'm going to say in terms of why did we get here, I think was sort of a breakdown of the sense of common purpose at the WTO. And again, whether or not the WTO has done what it needs to do to shift, it's sort of raison d'etre. I mean, if you started out, you know, with the GATT and really with the original WTO, you know, the primary function of the system was supposed to be, in essence, trade liberalization and, more importantly, enforcing non-discrimination rules, MFN and national treatment. Again, that only works if there is at some level a common sense of purpose that those are the dominant and critical goals. And now what you've seen happen is the rise of China, which says to many countries, no, 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 there's a huge failure here to recognize the substantial rise of China and included within that subsidies. And there has been an inability for the system to take on board the sort of issues that are really of concern with respect to the treatment of the environment, with respect to labor, with respect to development itself, as well as to take on the new issues of the pandemic and of the digital economy. So across all of those, I think some of those are woven in and out of Greg's book, but some of them I think may represent something slightly different, but at a bottom line, I think we're both coming out at the same conclusion. There has been a failure to update the trading system, which is what has led us to where we are. And I think Greg's book does such a good job of sort of cataloging the sort of places and ways in which the trading system has not been updated along the way.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for those comments, Jennifer. Let me now turn it over to Amrita to hear your views. Amrita?
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you, Gabrielle, Annabelle, and Greg for inviting me to be a part of this trade dialogue. It's always a pleasure to come back home to the WTO, even if virtually this time. And my hearty congratulations to Greg for his latest book on this really important topic. And there's a lot that I like about this book, but in the interest of time, let me just highlight one major gap that Greg's book fills in the literature. So there's been a good deal of research on emerging powers over the last 20 years, but much of this research has been about diffusion of norms from the center to the periphery. And I deliberately use those words, center to periphery, or the core and periphery, and associated assumptions of norm convergence with the center. Very few have studied countries of the global south as actors in their own right, with agency to influence and change rules and norms at the global level. And Greg does this very meticulously and perhaps uniquely with his focus on international trade law and how key players from the global south are not only being shaped by it, but are also shaping it. And he offers us an interesting and convincing theory of transnational legal ordering to systematize his insights. So kudos, Greg. I've enjoyed reading parts of the book and I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing as well. Why did we get to this point of recurrent deadlock and disengagement in the WTO? And I agree with much of Greg's account and also with some of the points that Jennifer has raised. But I will add 3 further important factors, not necessarily legal factors. First, the fact that the WTO did undergo changes in its decision-making processes to make them more inclusive and transparent, right? I mean, unlike many other international organizations, the WTO has adapted to the changing balance of power. But this also meant that while legitimacy of decisions increased, their efficiency declined. And recurrent deadlock has not helped with the credibility of trade multilateralism. Second, is something that tends to be overlooked in economic and legal debates in Geneva is the importance of political narratives. And even though trade under the umbrella of the WTO has contributed to much global good, including poverty alleviation, its supporters did not develop a convincing and clear narrative on why trade multilateralism is actually valuable to real people. And this is something that populist leaders have capitalized on and helped reinforce trade skepticism. And that trade skepticism, we know, it has fairly deep roots. President Biden has told us America is back, but we see a continuation of some trade policies even under the Biden administration. Because some of those concerns that people are raising are real and they have to be addressed. And third, our post-war multilateral institutions were premised on the assumption that prosperity and peace were inextricably and positively linked. But recent work by Henry Farrell and Abe Newman, so not the 2014 piece, which you do use in the book, Greg, but the 2019 paper. In that paper, they show how the networks that global supply chains constitute are deeply hierarchical, giving some states that control network hubs power to weaponize interdependence. And this means that there are trade-offs involved sometimes between economic gain and security. Under some circumstances, not MFN-based liberalization, but again, I use the words provocatively, selective decoupling in strategic sectors might be an answer. And hence the securitization of trade that we're seeing. Add to this the question of different political and economic systems, and then weaponized interdependence becomes an even more fundamental challenge to the system of trade governance that has served us very well for the last 70 or so years. So I'll stop there, some food for thought.
Thank you very much, Amrita, for your remarks. Let me now bring in John Hancock to hear from him. John.
Those are tough acts to follow, Annabelle. And that's so I'll get out of it by agreeing with everyone. First of all, Gregory, it's a great book. It really is a fantastic book. It's, among other things, it's a real pleasure to read. And I'm in the Jennifer camp. I'd seen earlier drafts of this book, and they're outstanding. It's not just an academic contribution. It's a really compelling narrative. I completely agree with your thesis. I think you've seen a seismic shift of the role of developing countries in the system, although I think that even that is changed, right? I mean, it's not a useful label anymore. It never was a particularly useful label, but it's really not so useful when you're trying to compare a China and an India and a Brazil. They're all very different. And I like your idea of how engaging in this system with the way you put it, you're damned if you do, you're doubly damned if you don't. But once you're in it, it's a kind of an education or a proselytizing process, right? You get absorbed in the process of legalization, and you learn the system, you learn its language, and that you get almost subconsciously co-opted into the system. The last thing that I really like, and this is in a way, I guess, picking up on what Jennifer said, how many of our problems today are functions of our successes? And we tend to forget that, or, beware what you wish for. We're in a world of deep trade integration. Of course, that causes more friction, far more than would have existed between the two superpowers during the Cold War. You legalize the system, you almost inevitably drift towards a kind of a litigation of international relations rather than a political solution. And the biggest one, our enormous success in widening development has created a multipolar world. And I think that, to me, is the crux of the problem, to be really simplistic about it. If you emerge out of the Second World War, all the architects were shaped by the 1930s. They were shaped by the lesson that if you don't trade, if you drift into regional blocks, if you have financial instability, you have war. So we're going to come out with a system where, to quote Roosevelt, you have a new deal for everyone, and you want to make the world look like Ohio or Wisconsin or Chicago. If we're all rich, if we all have houses, we all have jobs, if our kids go to college, if you're like us, world, you're not going to go to war. Well, presto, they got it. The world's increasing like us. Anyone who goes to Shanghai or Beijing, it's a lot like going to Vancouver or San Francisco. And yet the problem is, they're a lot like you and they eclipse you. And you get this tension between the sort of zero sum, the positive sum relations of economics. More trade will enrich everyone. they'll get more powerful. And the zero-sum calculation of geopolitics, which is, I think, the tension that exists now in the sense, well, wow, if we allow China to continue to develop, and if we keep opening up, that means our strategic rival gets that much more powerful, and we're no longer number one. And I guess that's my one worry. I think the United States and China are drawing the wrong lessons, absolutely almost diametrically the wrong lessons from each other's success right now. I think subliminally the US thinks that authoritarianism in economics kind of works. And that if you only come up with a well-designed industrial policy, and if you subsidize enough, and if you control the means of production, you can build back better. And I see it everywhere. I mean, we've got a subsidies race going on. We've got the age of big government coming back. And of course, if you talk to the Chinese, they'll tell you, no, that's not how we succeeded. We succeeded because we listened to you, United States. We let markets, we unleashed markets, we opened up, we joined the WTO, we encouraged FDI. Our state-owned enterprises aren't the secret of our success. They're actually our liability. They're kind of a giant social policy that's a drag on our development. If you got your wish west and we actually liberalized the way you want, we'd even be more competitive. So I think the US is drawing the lesson, and I think China's drawing the wrong lesson. They look at the US and they think democracy and information liberalization and sharing of ideas and thoughts over the internet is a disaster, and you've got to clamp that down. But of course, that's all part of why free markets work and why innovation works and why capitalism works. If you have an information system largely designed around keeping the people in power, if that's your number one goal in information management, you're not going to end up as a super innovative country. So I worry that both sides are drawing the wrong lessons. My last hopeful thought is I actually also think, despite that, these two superpowers have far more in common than they realize. And we're kind of seeing it with this OECD tax deal. I think you're starting to see it shape up over environmental issues that actually, despite the geopolitical rhetoric, if these two powers were maybe smaller and in the same club, they'd actually find they have a lot to agree on. But anyway, Greg, it's a great book, and your basic thesis is, I think, that's the paradox. Why is the United States back away from a system it created? Partly because it's afraid of what it created.
Thank you very much, John, for those comments, which actually provide a nice segue into the next question that I'd like to pose to Greg, which is, okay, so we've heard a bit about Brazil, China, India coming into the organization and shaping the way it works. So can you now share with us what is your view about the future of the organization? So we've seen what has happened. So what comes next, and what can you tell us about that and what do you tell us about that in your book? And with this, I have to say goodbye to everyone. What a fantastic panel. Fortunately, it's being recorded, so I will come back at it. And Gabriel will continue from now on. So thank you very much. And Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to quickly share the screen again. The book only briefly addresses this in broad terms. But what I'm going to do is, let's see, view. What I'm going to do is I have an article which directly addresses sort of how this comes back to John Jackson, the great pioneer in trade law, seeing the WTO in terms of an interface between economic systems. I think there are broadly three alternatives. One is this is where we are right now, which is a return to power-based bargaining and the binding WTO dispute settlement, and the relations between China, the US, and other powers will be based on bargaining power. Second is, and you see this, perhaps best captured in Petros Mavroidis and Andrei Sapir's new book on China and WTO, is to add more WTO legal constraints on state subsidies and SOEs to enforce a certain form of market of capitalism across all WTO members. I think we'll see. This will be a negotiation, but I am not optimistic. So I propose a third alternative, which is a pragmatic rebalancing within a multilateral framework. And this gets to Jennifer's big point, is where can we find a common purpose within the system, which has been lost? And John's point as well is how could we retain the relevance of this system, and China and the US and others create some sort of new modus vivendi with respect to the WTO acting as an interface. And I think this will require greater policy space. Jennifer mentioned import relief measures. I followed WTO appellate body jurisprudence on this. It seems strange that this should be, for many outsiders, if you came from Mars, that this is what would blow up the entire system. But I think we would need to create policy space for, if the rules, or there's any ambiguity in the rules, to decide on behalf of the respondent, and then based on that, they can renegotiate the rules. But this is a way to retain multilateral oversight and dispute settlement. So the key question is also, as Jennifer pointed out, what's the relationship between multilateralism, plurilateralism, and unilateralism? You're going to see a lot of norm development in plurilateral and bilateral agreements. That's just inevitable. You're going to see disputes in a lot of bilateral bargaining, and you'll see some unilateral measures. But the key is how to have them governed by multilateral rules, which can lead to proportionate rebalancing, which to me lies at the heart of the WTO system. If you don't comply, there's a rebalancing until you do comply. And so the key principles remain non-discrimination, transparency, which I think is critical, and the book and the article talks about this. Policy space to respond to externalities. I know there's divisions on this as to whether, and the WTO already, in my view, has a lot of policy space, but I think this has got to be critical in terms of the common purpose of letting countries respond to the external effects of others' actions. But any response has to be proportionate. And so I see the big challenges are threefold in terms of three interfaces: the economic interface, different forms of capitalism; the geopolitical and national security interface, clearly we're involving great power politics now, especially in the cutting edge of technology, artificial intelligence, and so forth; and the normative social policy interface, human rights, labor practices, and so forth. So we have self-protection, existing rules. The question is, what form of new rules? I don't have time to go through. We can talk about each of these interfaces. But basically, the argument is you need to provide more policy space across the three interfaces. The options then is dispute settlement, which is obviously dear to me and to many others. Could return to it. It could be contingent on new procedural and substantive rules and clarifications. That's my hope. You could see a complement of applying more non-adjudicatory measures, especially for national security issues. So some real strategic thinking on soft law, and you maybe creating a new committee to work these processes forward. Or unfortunately, where we are now is a variable geometry for dispute settlement, which actually looks more like the UN and the ICJ. It's based on reciprocity. The optional protocol of the ICJ is that you can only bring a case against me if I can bring a case against you. And so that's what we see with certain countries agreeing to binding dispute settlement on a reciprocal basis. And so that's my conclusion in terms of these three interfaces. Creating greater policy space with many of the norms being developed, not necessarily first in the WTO, but in other fora. Gabrielle?
Sorry, thank you, Craig. I had difficulty unmuting. So I already have tons of questions for you if the participant don't, but I'll invite Jennifer to comment on this second part, the future.
Again, I think Greg has come up with just a fabulous way for us all to sort of think about this. I mean, where do we go forward based on a lot of the things that he has said? And I totally agree in terms of the various places in which this could go in terms of multilateral, the relationship between the multilateral and the plurilateral and the bilateral, and then where dispute settlement under the multilateral, plurilateral, and bilateral takes us. And for me, part of it is, I think layered into this needs to be a stepping back from that to think about what substantive issues can be really dealt with under each one of the various parameters. Because when I do that stepping back, where I come back to is I do think there are certain key issues that simply cannot be dealt with at the bilateral or even the plurilateral level that will have to be dealt with logically, substantively at the multilateral level. And so for me, it's sort of interesting to think about what everything Greg has done, which is just really helpful in terms of laying out where these various roads may take us. But I'll just throw out a couple of issues onto this table of, for me, for example, subsidies and the disciplines on subsidies are ones that at my level sense have to be addressed at the multilateral global level. It is simply really hard to think about whether countries could, in a bilateral or even in a plurilateral, agree to what would be viewed as either unilaterally disarm in terms of agree not to do subsidies, or again, create subsidy disciplines if the goods themselves are going to be traded globally. It's just hard to see how you don't need some of the subsidy disciplines. And this is where a lot of the heart of the dispute between the United States and China, and to some degree, lots of others, and many would say where one of the big failures of the WTO substantive rules have been on this issue of disciplining subsidies. Second, for me, is basic rules on trade and services. I mean, it is simply almost impossible for most countries to create two sets of services regimes, one for the countries with whom they have some kind of a regional or bilateral agreement, and another for the rest of the world, because at some level, services rules are about regulation, domestic regulation. And for most countries, having dual sets of regulations, depending on where that service is coming in from, is nigh onto impossible. So again, services is one of those areas where I think you have to remain at the multilateral level. Trade facilitation. I mean, to me, the whole concept behind the trade facilitation agreement was sort of one-stop shopping and one set of rules that were very clear for all traders in order to sort of wrench out that 24-25% cost additive to having to deal with multiple rules in multiple jurisdictions. Again, you'd only get those efficiencies if they occur at the multilateral level. The transparency issue, again, is one that pervades across all of these, and again, would be better done at the big multilateral level. Next on my list would be the sort of relationship with global standards. I mean, if you think about a lot of the WTO agreements, whether it's the TBT agreement or the SPS agreement, or coming soon, maybe more WTO, interaction with telecommunication standards, those standards are global. And so again, the issue is whether or not regional or bilateral agreements can really take on board recognition of standards which are in and of themselves perceived to be global. IP protection. I mean, again, for all that we might think about goods moving only regionally or bilaterally, ideas and intellectual property are clearly moving globally. And so again, it's one of those areas where again, I think, I would sort of say layered on top of Greg's really analysis might be some sort of looking at the substantive issues of which ones could, should, ought to fit into a multilateral framework, which ones could, should, would be better addressed at a regional level where it may be easier to create the kind of policy space that Greg is talking about. And I totally agree with that idea that across all three regimes, you're going to need to find that policy space and which ones can be addressed at a bilateral level. So I just, for me, it would be an additional layering on what Greg has done, but I think it's a really interesting framework and a very helpful one in terms of how we think about moving forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. Wonderful presentation. There are questions about policy space, but I'll go to Amrita first, and then I'll mention some of the questions we've received. Amrita, please.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I agree with Jennifer that some areas really do need a multilateral and a global approach. And also some of the issues, some of the examples that she gave us. Having said that, I just don't know if there's enough agreement amongst the diverse parties, that multipolar world that we're living in, to get to that point. You know, that would contribute to the global public good, but there are parties there which are questioning what the particular global public goods should be in the first place. So having recognized the beauty of what Jennifer is saying, I have to sort of go with Greg's pragmatism here. And I like the way you think about this, Greg, like the way you've talked about these three policy interfaces, right, on sort of economic policy space, right? So the economics policy space, the national security policy space, and social policy choices. I also think you're spot on the question of plurilaterals, bilaterals, some kind of variable geometry is what we're talking about here. But facilitating, it's a great idea to think about these policy spaces, but that's easier said than done because of the difficulties we will likely have there as well, as we've had before, on distinguishing what, you know, my legitimate policy choice is your protectionism, right? And there is fundamental disagreement there. I mean, the fact that trade policy, sort of trade monitoring reports can't even talk about subsidies just shows how deep that disagreement is. And then even more in the current context, because there is a great deal of variation amongst members on what they want those policy choices to be. And one of the fault lines is between democratic states and authoritarian ones. So, and this sort of goes back to the Eikenberry point. The WTO, did it stand for a liberal order? And now is the WTO under the system that you mentioned and the one that I say we also need? Is the WTO going to let 100 flowers bloom? And perhaps it could, but this would fundamentally alter the nature of the regime as one that stands for a liberal order. And then this would indeed impact on not only the competitiveness of goods and services for the kinds of conflict that we see right now, but also security issues, and thereby potentially creating new problems from the policy space thus carved out. And so I have some further thoughts on this, and I'm happy to brainstorm further together. But let me just throw two ideas into the mix that Greg has given us, and also what Jennifer said, that could contribute to addressing some of the problems. And one, whichever, no matter how perfect, if there is a perfect solution, right? No matter how perfect that solution is, no matter how perfect that innovation is, none of these innovations are going to suffice unless we start paying attention to this issue of narratives. We might come up with the purpose of the WTO together, right? Right now in Geneva in different contexts, but if it doesn't appeal to electorates, we won't stand a chance of preserving the system. And second, while we will probably, I think we'll have to move along the lines of some kind of variable geometry, let's not make these exclusive transatlantic parties or even a great power party, right? There's a lot of differentiation within the global South amongst developing countries, whatever you want to call them, and also within the emerging powers, as your book shows too, Greg. And so China and India often stand together on SDT, for instance, but there is considerable rivalry and competition between these two countries on geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. And awareness of these differences is important, as it may help in not only more inclusive arrangements, but also ones that facilitate higher levels of integration amongst like-minded partners. So the politics will, Rob House wrote about this in an article in 2002, where he talked about the technocratic tendency of the WTO and the importance of politics. And I was rereading that article again, and And I think he got it right. I don't think we can just sort of hermeneutically seal off the politics. And the sooner we learn to deal with the politics, the more likely we are to be able to preserve the wonderful good and enhance the good that the system does. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Amrita. John, the last discussant, you have a nice role.
I'll be fast here. I tend to, I don't think we're at a Bretton Woods moment where we're going to get everyone agreeing on the grand redesign of the system. I'm much more in favor of an organic, bottom-up, learn by doing approach to WTO reform. And in that sense, I'll tell you a quick anecdote. I used to work for Renato Ruggiero, who was one of the original WTO director generals. And he said, you know, John, whenever you're in a negotiation, I'm not going to copy his Italian accent. He goes, whenever you're in a negotiation, always start from the areas of agreement and move to the areas of disagreement. And this seems like a no-brainer, but it's amazing how often in our system we start on the most difficult issues and we ram our heads against brick walls and we don't make any progress. And this is not working. This is not working. The WTO's finished. And in reality, there's actually areas where you could converge and make progress that are often not have the highest profile. And I think our current DG is trying to do that. I fully support what she says. You know, you succeed by succeeding and just find the things that work. They may not be the be all and end all issues like, you know, free flowing data or getting industrial subsidies under control, but they'll build confidence in the system. And my final point on that, the flip side of that argument is I think we should avoid at all costs ideological battles. I mean, you know, getting into a debate about whether your political system is legitimate or not, and whether or not democracy is superior to authoritarian regimes, that's great in the pages of you know, Foreign Affairs magazine, but it's going to be a disaster in our system. No government is going to engage in a negotiation which they think is about their illegitimacy and dismantling them. They're just not going to do it. So we should be pragmatic. And you know, the system, if it does lead to a more liberal order, which I think it is already doing and will do, it will be bottom up, not because someone lectured another country on their political system.
Thank you, John. Here is how I suggest we continue. There's questions, I have questions, so I suggest I'll read out a few questions to each of you, starting of course with Greg, and then you'll answer those you like. In the meantime, new questions could come up in the chat. So Craig, one question to which you have answered, but I think it's important. One colleague asked, how can you basically have more policy space? Would it not be at the cost of weakening the dispute settlement or the rule of law? And allow me to just add, I tend to disagree with the question and agree with your short answer that at the beginning, the appellate body started in gasoline saying that this policy space for environment is about rights of states and also obligations of states outside the WTO. Well, that's one question for you, Craig. Also, you mentioned in your slides, the first shot of slides, that it means the system greater role for lawyers. And you wondered whether all this transnational trade did not lead to stronger states rather than weaker, possibly in favor of SOEs, for instance. So I'm asking you, in WTO, at least recently, since the disappearance of the appellate body, the role of lawyers have gone down. When I started 25 years ago, I was the 4th lawyer helping on disputes. We went up to 80, and now the whole appellate body was dismantled. So how to reconcile that? And isn't it COVID that has led to recognition that states are needed in times of crisis, reinforcing states? Jennifer, you two things you mentioned. WTO would have lost or is losing the sense of common purpose, and that there's a failure in not recognizing China's sort of, if I understood correctly, differences or distinctions. So on the sense of common purpose, from an insider, with COVID, and possibly thanks to, it's mainly WDG, the WTO now is leading all the debate on IP, on vaccine, and all those discussions with supply chain, producers, manufacturer, with WHO, but it has become a central sort of forum of in times of COVID and for vaccines, and its TPR has been sort of argued to be the solution. Amrita, I like very much your spontaneous sort of compliment to the WTO, saying WTO has adapted for being more inclusive, but there are very strong argument contrary or claiming the opposite of what you said with GSI. And the GSI, on the contrary, in my view, is a new air, new ideas, and the solution. So maybe you can comment on this. And John, many things you said are very interesting, but as noted in your introduction, you have led a lot of very pragmatic changes, aid for trade, investment, plastic, and all this. And then you ended up saying, maybe the US is afraid of what it created. But I'm asking you, is there only one US? I think everybody's still talking about the old US with President Trump, and maybe we didn't give enough time to President Biden, but you're right, and you can add on comments on this, that WTO cannot be an ideological battleground. For instance, on SOEs, the starting point should not be should China, others have SOEs or not SOEs. The issue is, should all members sort of be disciplined for their subsidies, wherever they come from or through. So I suggest that we may have more questions coming. In the meantime, why don't you maybe comment on each other if you want to add to anything, and maybe respond to these questions if you want. Craig.
Great. Well, thank you, Gabrielle. And thanks also to Jennifer, Amrita, and John. I mean, fascinating comments and suggestions. So first, just on the policy space and rule of law. I mean, now, we're at a situation where we don't have a functioning rule of law system in the WTO in terms of binding impartial automatic dispute settlements. So one can have, the rule of law is based on what the agreed rules are, and then having certain institutional mechanisms to, so that it simply, it means that you can rely on a third neutral party as opposed to just use of force and use of brute power. And so my view is that there's clearly lack of consensus. There's dissensus in terms of how the rules should be interpreted, what the rules should be going forward. And so the only way is to have some sort of understanding. And this goes back to John's point. I mean, the WTO has been a great success, right? It's okay to say we're going to provide a bit more policy space going forward in order to reach sort of a common interface between very different economic systems in a very different geopolitical environment. I think that's the only way going forward. One side's not going to prevail on the other, and in my view. Now, one can try, of course, and I don't think the subsidy negotiations are going to be successful in the WTO with 100, over 160 members, but it's clearly there can be bilateral or regional or plurilateral discussions on this to see. The fact is, actually, on subsidies, Article 41 of China's Working Party, accession protocol already covers a lot of this, right? And SOEs working on a market-based manner. So it's unclear, in some ways, what more is going to be added. Are they just going to add this to the whole system? I think that's going to be very difficult. And so, yeah, my idea is, how can we bring back the rule of law in international trade and create some sort of harmony, but based on a system that recognizes the importance of flexibility for state policy across these three domains. It's still going to be subject to, in my vision of it, to multilateral rules and dispute settlement. And it potentially can lead to rebalancing, which is exactly what we've gotten in the sense of trade wars, just unilateral measures of 21% tariffs. It's not in anybody's interest to go this route. And so hopefully we can try to find a multilateral solution to this. The greater role for lawyers is fascinating. I think, one is lawyers in terms of international trade are going to remain very active. They're becoming active in commercial arbitration and signing contracts for the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth outside of the WTO. It's nice to have lawyers at the multilateral level, given all the externalities on third parties and competition and so forth. So it's still, I think we should compare it to the way it was, right? The fact that you still have this many lawyers is a good sign. Now, that might continue to diminish if WTO dispute settlement simply is going to become a historical artifact. And it's going to become more like the United Nations as sort of a talk shop with no binding dispute settlement. So I think we need to think really hard about how to bring this back. And my own hope is that in the Biden administration, they are trying to work through in sort of a very sort of step-by-step basis, resolving existing problems with the European Union and other countries, and then eventually being able to make a proposal. That's the hope. Otherwise, we're stuck where we are, maybe, for my lifetime. And then, yes, I think the overall vision has to be an enhanced role for state autonomy and state public policy. COVID made this clear. Of course, COVID also made clear the need for the WTO and for discussions and for not breaking, a lot of the problems are because of, unilateral measures, and that different countries produce different aspects of vaccines or other sort of essential medical equipment. So we need it. But there's going to have to be both a forum for deliberation, which is in everybody's interest, but as well sort of a recognition that ultimately, states are responsible for their citizens, and that's their primary role. And the WTO simply can't, no international institution can perform that role.
Thank you. There are more questions, but for the next round, we'll have the time. Jennifer, add one sort of semi-question to you. You mentioned that about China, but isn't it the blaming the system for not recognizing China's difference? Isn't it the negotiators at the time that maybe failed to recognize that China is different and could grow away from promises of getting closer to capitalism? Go ahead and answer this.
So again, I'll try to weave them all together. I mean, you started, your first question to me was a little bit on whether the WTO is losing its sense of common purpose and what do we do about it. And part of my answer to some degree reflects back on where John finished, which is we can't have a fight over ideology. And part of my questioning is, can we avoid it? Because I fear, that for me, for a very long time, there was a clear sort of line. I mean, we could debate about exactly where it was, but there was sort of an understanding that there was a line between economic security and national security, and that the WTO played clearly in the economic security realm, and its rule book in essence extended to that realm and not to the national security realm. And what we've obviously seen over the last number of years is a complete erasing of that line between national security and economic security. And again, it's not just the US tariffs on steel and aluminum, allegedly in the name of national security. But again, you're obviously seeing it now in the disputes that invoke Article 21 of the GATT and in others. And so part of my question for John is, can we put the genie back in the bottle? I mean, can we go back to, a world in which there was an understanding that the WTO was going to focus on the sort of economic security side, and other institutions, the UN or others, are more on the national security side? That's just, for me, sort of a question that sort of gets to this issue. My reaction and to the issue about common purpose comes from two things. I mean, one is, I think, if you look at what happened, the G20 trade ministers had a meeting at which they said, can we all agree that the WTO, the common purposes of the WTO, and they agreed on an awful lot about transparency and a rules-based system, etc. But 4 issues, and I think that it's significant, 4 issues where, again, even among the G20, so this is not even the WTO writ large, but even among the G20, 4 issues where the statements were, no, we do not agree that this is one of the founding principles or, the bedrock of the WTO. And it started with employing market-oriented policies. So again, that goes right there to that US-China debate. It was whether or not, the role of special and differential treatment. Again, another one where there was not an agreement. Whether or not sustainability fits within the WTO rules and how, and the practice of consensus decision making. So all four of those were areas where, at least even among the G20, there is a sense of no, we do not agree on where this common purpose is. And my sense is some of those are fundamental enough that it's very hard to see how the WTO moves forward unless you resolve them. And then to answer your last question, Gabrielle, in terms of China, again, from my money, if you will, there was a lot of, I don't want to say fault, but I mean, a lot of missteps or whatever on both sides. Again, I think if I step back and look at, sort of whether or not the US and other expectations of what they were getting when China joined the WTO, what was actually in its protocol, what was actually in its working party report in terms of the binding paragraphs, here's where, again, my sense was there was an over expectation, I think, on some people's part. And at the same time, the commitments that China made, particularly around this state-owned enterprise subsidy issue, again, were pretty strong commitments that I think it's pretty fair to say have not been lived up to. I mean, China agreed, again, in a binding part of its working party report, that it would ensure that all state-owned and state-invested enterprises would make purchases and sales based solely on commercial considerations: price, quality, marketability, and availability, and that the enterprises of other WTO members would have an adequate opportunity to compete for sales to and purchases from these enterprises on non-discriminatory terms and conditions. Okay, whether China should or shouldn't have promised that, we can all debate, but there is just, I don't think there's any dispute that it is not where we are today. I mean, China's state-owned enterprises are not making all decisions based solely on commercial considerations. That's just not where we are. And at the same time, if you step back and look at it, again, China agreed in its protocol to be subject to a selective safeguard provision that would apply only to China. Nobody used it. I mean, the United States in the end brought one case under this selective safeguard provision, no others. Many of the provisions that were within China's protocol, again, China was not held to them over a significant period of time. So again, I think there was both sort of unfair or whatever expectations, and on the other hand, China has not lived up to all of its commitments, and the rest of the world has not done everything that it might have or could have to try to hold China further to account. So again, I think very tricky. On the last question to me was on the COVID front. To me, the opportunity for the WTO to step up and deliver is so clear in the COVID area. And again, I think so far you are seeing countries do the right thing in terms of step away from export controls, remove some of those, lower their tariffs on everything that it takes to fight COVID. To me, that is a sign of good things. Again, and the vaccines is the final test for the WTO. If at the end of the day, the WTO can help facilitate the fair, efficient, effective distribution of pharmaceuticals around the world, again, it may help us answer that narrative question that I would totally agree with Amrita needs to be addressed, which is, can the WTO satisfy the needs of the world? And COVID presents a perfect opportunity to answer that question. Yes, we can, but it's going to take, again, proving that the WTO was up to the challenge. I think good progress so far, but we're not done.
Thank you. Amrita, please. I hope we have another round because there are more questions.
Let me pick up.
Go ahead, Amrita.
Let me pick up quickly on some of those very insightful comments from Jennifer, most of which I fully agree with. On the COVID question, the verdict is still out, right? I mean, we're seeing the EU's position on this, which looks rather different from the Biden administration's. So it depends on where you're coming from and where you sit, right? I mean, if you speak with people in India or South Africa, you know this very well, sitting in Geneva, what some of the issues are there. So I won't go over those arguments right now, except to point out that one lesson from the COVID experience could be, if the WTO does this well, that how much multilateral cooperation can help, can save lives. If it gets it wrong, the message is going to be, don't trust those unreliable global value chains. Shorten those chains, work only with allies. That will be the lesson, right? The second point I want to address is John's, because taking into account politics does not mean taking into account ideology. Those are two different things. For me, you have to take into account power considerations. And this nice, clean, technical, legal world that we sometimes build for ourselves in the Brussels bubble and the Geneva bubble misses out on the power questions, especially when you're at the receiving end of power. Third, to Gabrielle's point, please. You talked about, you mentioned GSI, and my point, yes, that's true.
You mentioned inclusiveness, and I pointed
correct.
to GSI.
And my point on inclusiveness is, look at decision-making structures in many other organizations, UN Security Council, IMF, and so forth, and they have not adapted, and the WTO has, and it deserves credit for it, right? And from the green room to where we were throughout the Doha negotiations, that is something worth crediting the organization for. It also led to problems which we would have anticipated, and therefore there was very interesting discussions on what are the alternatives to consensus-based decision-making. And I don't think it's a return to the green room. I think there are some very, very interesting solutions that we could come up with that involve critical mass. But that is only one part of the problem, because there are the other problems that Jennifer just talked about, and those are very fundamental differences. And the lawyer question, right? And here I'm going to disagree just slightly with Gabrielle and Greg here, because of course you need to have, you have a rules-based system. Of course you need to have lawyers in the organization and lawyers having a voice. The problem is that when the DDA started running into deadlocks, and I'm thinking back to 2007, 2008, 2009, lawyers were talking about, let's litigate the way out of deadlock, right? That's how you get accusations of overstretch, overreach, right? And that this isn't, I mean, unless we decide the WTO is something completely different, it's not a negotiating forum, it's a court, then fine, then agreed, that's what we should do. But if it's a negotiating forum, then that's not where we are yet. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. And Kian, can we have an extra 5 minutes, you think? Because I'd like to give the words to, after John, to Craig.
Sure, as long as the audience is willing to stay, we can have 5 minutes.
Thank you. So John,
these are so many interesting ideas out there, and I have to say that I listened to to Greg and the other panelists, and I agree with what they're saying. But I'm going to be a devil's advocate just for a second. I love this H.G. Wells quote. You know, history is more and more a race between education and catastrophe. And I'm struck, you know, that he was talking about nuclear war and nuclear proliferation, but I kind of think it's our world right now. We're so information rich and so wisdom or understanding in deficit. I worked, as you said, Gabrielle, you mentioned, I tried to get help members get a plastics initiative going on plastics pollution. And the big taker was China. And I think it's because China's drowning in plastics. They had blocked imports of everyone's plastic waste. They didn't want to be a dumping ground for the world's plastics anymore. And they naively thought that if they started a plastics initiative in the WTO, everyone would join because they thought it was a good idea and they were all doing something for plastics pollution themselves. And to my surprise, to China's surprise, everyone said, what's their hidden agenda? You know, what are they trying to get? What's the secret? You know, I got this from very serious delegations, very senior people. And I don't think they had a hidden agenda, or if they did, they kept it really well concealed from me. I think they just thought it was a good idea. And I think there's a lot of things like that on the table right now. I don't want to sound like an apologist for China, because I think they do shoot themselves in the foot a lot as well. But, you know, my basic bottom baseline position is I think China has emerged as a super competitive economy. full stop. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to us. Anyone who had watched Hong Kong, anyone who had watched Singapore, anyone who had watched Japan before, these are very competitive, very entrepreneurial societies. And once they ditch, full-scale Marxism, we're going to be unleashed on the world. I mean, the surprise isn't that they've risen so fast, is that we're all so surprised by it. And I was sitting on a panel the other day, and I'm gonna blow this quote, but it was a young woman talking about some investor in Silicon Valley, and the investor's line was, in the Silicon Valley, we fight, but we fight like gentlemen and women. In China, they fight like gladiators. This is the irony of the last communist holdout country is actually the most hyper-capitalist of all of us. That is not to say that China always plays by the rules. That is not to say that there aren't concerns about industrial subsidies and intellectual property protection, etc. But I'm struck as an amateur historian by how much this rhetoric was used on the emerging EU powers after the miracle 30 years in the 1960s and 70s, how much exactly the same language was used for Japan in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, then it was, Japan cheats, Japan's not playing by the rules, Japan's doing this, and now it's applied to China. Equally, I frankly think China shoots itself in the foot. My last historical parallel, I think China's like the United States in the 1920s. They didn't realize, or they didn't want to acknowledge that they were the emerging power, and they didn't want to pay the full price for being a global leader. And I think there's lots of things, I'm not going to say them here, that China could do that wouldn't actually cost them a lot, but would make everyone feel a little bit more comfortable about China as a partner, and they're not doing it. I think it's inexplicable. But I guess I go back to my point. I actually think that the advanced countries, and I would include China in that, have a lot more in common than they have differences right now. And that includes global warming, that includes plastics pollution. I fundamentally agree with Greg's point that in the end, multilateralism it's about laws and rules and rule of law, not the rule of power. But it's a kind of weird educative experience. I mean, it's like we all go back to school and learn about our interdependencies, and we have to add to that role, not subtract from it. I mean, even during the crazy Brexit debates, and we get it a little bit with China, how even your average woman and man on the street have become experts on, on quotas and customs unions versus free trade areas. I mean, there's a kind of an educative process that goes on here. And, if we're looking at Greg's third way, we have to think of ways we enhance that educative function. Is it through really thinking more seriously about our transparency mechanisms, so we really engage the private sector and teaching us about where the barriers are, where liberalization is working? It's a boring subject in WTO, but some of my colleagues are experts on our committee systems, where countries actually get into these SPS and TBT committees and solve the problems without going to the courts, without making new rules. They literally just sit around a table and start solving the problems. I don't want to be a Panglossian here, but I kind of agree with where Greg's coming from. I think we need to kind of think a bit more outside of the box on this regime we've created.
Thank you, John. It's so fascinating. I'd like to give, and Kian, I'll need 3 minutes because we've already used 4 of the 5 you gave me. I'd like Craig to close the exchange, but still I pass you 2 questions. One from Henry Gao, because in your book you discussed how emerging powers learned from the US and others, but then John brought up the point that the US sort of learned the wrong lessons from China. What do you think? And the last question and your last words for today, of course, only, is you talked about the WTO without dispute settlement becoming a talk shop. I'm surprised because 50% of the budget and the time in this place is the regular work of committees where countries talk about their everyday problem. This is governance. What's wrong with this? Why do we need, as Amrita pointed, to only think in terms of litigation? So governance and talk shop. And please, you can close. We give you sort of 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. First, just your last point, I completely agree with you. Talk and deliberation are central. Litigation is not the be all or end all, so I didn't mean to suggest anything otherwise. So I'm going to start off just with Amrita's basic point about political narratives. And I'm going to say, here's two alternative political narratives for going forward. One, in my view, means basically the end of the WTO and multilateralism. It's reflected in a young Brazilian's paper he's working on, Henrique Coelho Moraes, which is basically we're moving into a world, sort of a realist world, political realist world, of everything's about relative gains, not joint gains. And so you want the other side to be hurt, right? You want to destroy their companies. There's sort of, you want to make sure Huawei is not successful and so forth. It basically then trade law becomes a form of arms control, right? As opposed to a rule of law system. The sides might agree that, you know, they have lots of weapons, and Rita mentioned weaponized interdependence, but they need to come up with some sort of agreement as when they use the weapons and when they don't, and tit for tat and so forth. That's a real possibility. Many people think that is the future. My view is that we need to rethink the purpose, the narrative of trade agreements, given both the new world order, right, of China's rise and the shift towards Asia, but also in terms of the problems of economic insecurity and inequality within countries. So to characterize the purpose of the WTO shouldn't be narrowly viewed in terms of free trade. It should be, the core purpose rather should be viewed as fourfold. First, to create a basic framework of rules for ongoing cooperation, planning, and to go back to Gabrielle, deliberation, discussion, talk. Second, to enhance standards of living. Third, to address the externalities of domestic measures on each other. I think that becomes core in an interdependent world. And fourth, to provide for an independent, neutral third-party decision maker to resolve disputes regarding these rules' implementation. That's what's been destroyed, and that somehow we need to bring back. You mentioned Henry's point. I try to be agnostic in terms of what's the relative role of state industrial policy, because I don't think anybody knows, right? What is successful industrial policy? What is successful, quote, pure free market capitalism, which doesn't exist because we have oligopolies and major US companies which have no competition in their particular sectors. And so how do we think about which economic model is best? I don't think we need WTO rules telling everybody that this particular capitalist economic model is the only one. I think there should be experimentation, especially for the rest of the WTO membership. So if the US is learning the wrong lessons from China by engaging industrial policy now, that's a US choice. If China is making bad decisions because they use SOEs and they do even better with having more private enterprises, which are, you know, statistically it shows that's the fastest growth rates in China, that's there. Let them make those mistakes. Just so we have this ability to address the externalities of their measures or our measures on each other. That's core for the WTO. And so I'll stop there. Hopefully with a
Thank you very much. I think that many of us would like to continue, but I'm afraid we have to say goodbye. So thank you, Craig. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Amrita, John. Thank you, of course, to Kian for the organization and all the advice, to Carol and to all participants. And I'm personally looking forward to meeting you all in person very soon.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Thanks, Kian.
Yeah, thanks, Kian.
Bye.
Bye.
And thanks to Annabelle.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Oh, thank
Annabelle.
you, Annabelle, of course. Thank you. Thanks.